Good afternoon, everybody. I am procrastinating. It's Monday afternoon, and I had some things. I have a lot of stuff that I need to get added into my maps, but I'm just not feeling it right now. And so I have a lot of ideas that I wanted to sort of share and sort of more puzzle pieces to lay out if people are interested. So I figured I would just do a quick live and talk about it a little bit. So I called this one I Speak in Maps. And so one of the challenges that I'm navigating lately is I have this sort of I've made all of these maps, right? Like starting with I had like 400 maps in Little Sis, or maybe not quite, but like 300 to 400 maps in Little Sis, and then those got a good number of those got wiped away. And then I started making maps in Kumu. And the thing about making these maps is they're relationship maps, if people are not familiar. And there's a process by which you have to actually like label, like conceptualize what you're going to put on a map, whether it's a thing or a person or a paper or an idea. And then you have to make the dot, and you have to make it the right color, and you have to make the font, adjust it and make the connection. And then what I've been doing lately is I'll go to the source material I have and I'll take a screenshot and I'll underline some things that I think are relevant. And then I'll upload the link and the screenshots into the map. And so each of these maps is sort of like becoming like a mind palace for how I've been exploring things. And the maps are not so much about the relationships, but it's almost like branching constellations of storylines and story arcs. And so by participating in that process, I feel like I've made my mind work in such a way that I have like these different connections to sort of diverse topics from, tin can API technology and learning architecture and VR to, financial derivatives with Ronald Cohen in London and Israel to, experiential game mechanics and gaming architectural systems and psychology, to, Esalen and, all of these things to game B, meta psychotechnology. And I built these neural connections, and each of those maps is sort of like a story. And then as I've built more maps, when I add something like, oh, I'm going to talk about how this intelligent heart program that Julian Gresher is doing is being piloted in Santa Barbara. So then I'll go to my Santa Barbara map and I'll take a screenshot of that and I'll circle the things that I think are most relevant and I'll upload the map. So it almost becomes like nested maps within maps within maps. And one of the video clips I put up last night was connected to this Plan Systems, this guy, Brendan Wallace, who is connected to Derek Bros and part of one of the Greater Resets, and he's based in Austin. And so they've got like essentially a mapping interface that is like a three-dimensional gamified interface. Now they make it look really simple. I know that the technology is there to make it look much more seamless with reality because that's what Cesium is doing. So I'm not sure why they make their interface look so cartoonish, unless it's like usually they release the public version to make it look cartoonish, and then a year or two later they'll be like, oh, look, it's all improved, right? But essentially, these mapping systems that they've created are, there was one that was a replica of downtown Austin in the Capitol. And then you could interleave information onto the map, and you can already do this with Google Maps too, but this is like more 3D, and then have immersive media. And then they were talking about like nested maps, which I was kind of intuitively doing, although not with the same level of architecture. And there's a huge amount of information. In fact, part of the reason I'm doing this today is like I'm feeling overwhelmed with the information that is relevant that I'm trying to put in the maps to sort out and leave as sort of an interactive bibliography for people who may be interested. And the nested layers, like, so I keep saying I'm kind of like walking off the edge of the map in a way, and not because I'm intentionally trying to leave people behind, but because I'm in search of novelty in the searching. And so my dopamine rush comes from finding the next new interesting shiny thing and like fitting it in. And hopefully that's useful to some people. I don't know. We'll see about that. I'm not saying that you should do what I do, but that's what I've been doing. And somebody at one point commented like, well, maybe we're all just experiencing itself and this thing is using me to fulfill its purpose. And I'm like, that has definitely occurred to me, right? Um, but at this point, the story I'm going to tell myself is that there's a benevolent, sacred force behind things. And if I was on the right track, I would know. And I'm just going to keep going because maybe God loves a good frolic in a game. And I'm trying to do my best with this. So one of the things, so I'm talking about maps. So like maps are starting to be my language, right? Because the challenge is, like I was making connections last night, again, just in my mind, that around Kurt Lewin and his theory of T group theory, which became advanced through MIT and Wharton, where you like unfreeze people and then you change them and then you refreeze them. And looking at that, where people are like molecules in a chemical reaction and agents, and that these triggering catalytic environments and game mechanics are going to be used to create social situations and like a chemical reaction, like a physics equation. That's what they were searching for. And it was going all the way back to Timothy Leary's dissertation in this thing called the cyclotron, which is Psychlotron. And so he was doing group dynamic therapy and behaviorism, but it was with this side of quantification where they would have someone annotating the group dynamics that were facilitated by the therapist and then fit them into a grid as a positive or negative. And so sort of reducing humans into these data points that could then be looked for patterns across time. And so what Leary was really interested in was speeding things up in this group interactive environment. And what I'm realizing is, okay, extended reality, spatial computing, ubiquitous surveillance, the Internet of Bio-Nano things, all of those together have created the cyclotron. And I don't know exactly how far back the cyclotron goes, or would we know that we're in it? Because increasingly I'm feeling like I'm in a gaming environment, like an active gaming environment, which is really kind of strange. And I'm trying not to let it be unsettling to me, but it's once you sort of see the timeline that these things have been well underway since the early 1990s with Neal Stephenson, then you're like, oh, well, probably this is pretty fully developed if Moore's law and all of that they actually had a handle on it in the late 80s and early 90s, that this stuff, the stuff that's public is probably a lot less than what's actually happening. So part of our challenge is information management, right? And that's kind of, I guess, what Jeremy Pitt was talking about, knowledge management, the right information to the right people at the right time, only they're going to build you a Web3 interface to decide this. Now, I'm not trying to build you a Web3 interface. I can only look at the information that's come into me and that's been processed through the lenses and the stories and the groupings that feel right to me, and then I remix them and put them out to you, and then you see what you think about them, and maybe some of you guys remix them and put them out in another way, and that's the information flow. But at this point, the physics of the amount of information coming in is huge, especially if you're trying to deal with it in more than a reactive, emotional way. So a lot of what's out there, now is sort of like doom scroll, like scroll, react. Don't actually deeply engage and think about philosophically what the implications are of the content you're dealing with. For the most part, it's a triggering event, trigger and move on. And so part of the reason I'm deferring on this is that I have a lot of white papers and really significant content that I'm feeling overwhelmed with, like how to actually get it, process it in a sufficient way, and then make it available for me in the future, because a lot of this is my own interactive bibliography. So I can find stuff and I don't lose track of it, and that I can share it with other people, like through the language of maps. But increasingly, it's feeling like spoken language, written language, because again, I've shifted from doing mostly writing to mostly speaking because it feels more efficient, although I'm clearly much more long-winded online than I am writing. How do we communicate? Like when we're dealing with vast quantities of information. So the answer, I think, for most people is you just silo and you pick an issue or a topic of expertise and you just focus on that, because there's so much you can just stay in your lane and go deep. But if you're a generalist and you're working across silos, how do you synthesize it for yourself? And then once you've made some observations on the breadth of content, how do you share it with others in a way that isn't just take my word for it, this is the thing, but like you can go back and look at it too. So that's how I've kind of arrived at this language of maps, which I didn't actually realize like when I made my first little cis map that that's what I was doing. But increasingly I'm like, here, look at this map. Like this map will tell you a story. If you just click through the links, like it's all source material, see what you think about it. And it's almost like a glyph, right? I guess that was the thing Leibniz was looking at with the Chinese characters, is that you have a character that's embedded with these layers of meaning. And that's, I think, what I've talked about a little bit with tokens, like that the token language might be a language of manifestation with layers of meanings at higher levels in broad, and then depending on the nuance that you're seeking, you could have deeper and deeper layers. And this connects to, what I've said about the Philip Pullman books and the Golden Compass and his darker materials, that this alethiometer, which is I guess the compass that the little girl Lyra uses, is that it has 3 choices of symbols, and she uses that to communicate, like to sort of express a question and get an answer that she interprets. But there's layers of symbolism from a surface level and a very easy layer to deeper and deeper levels. And I think the deeper levels go away from language and how we traditionally communicate in alphabets and things like that, to more intuitive knowings. And then how do we express those intuitive knowings? Because what I'm finding now as I make my maps and I have sort of this, a circle of collaborators that's not vast, like we're sort of in small intentional group of people in the same problem space, is that we're riffing off of one another. It is sort of like, a research equivalent of like a jazz ensemble, right? Like we're passing things back and forth and it's bubbling up. You feel into it, and then you have this knowing about it. And so I made this huge map a couple years ago with Lynn. She would feed me information. I would put stuff on the map of Dallas, centered on Pegasus Park, which is this former Exxon campus, former site of, I think, Zales or for artificial diamonds. And it's being remade. It's a really ugly complex from the 70s, but it's being remade as this cutting edge ed tech biotech hub. And now I've mapped it, but I didn't have the depth of experience of understandingness of it to really see it. Like I could, if you imagine at the Golden Compass with these layers of symbols, I was maybe in the top layer or top 2 layers, but now intuitively I've gotten deeper, not because I've added more to the map, but I've been in other spaces that's given me a knowing that I can now realize that, like, oh yeah, I'm thinking that the big super collider project that was planned, that Reagan authorized for Texas in the late 80s, it was canceled in the mid 90s, actually pivoted into something in the map, which is this new media consortium, which was a partnership of virtual environments that was linking Apple and Adobe and Sony, right? And then that links into the whole section with Peter Stone, who is the Sony contact for AI in North America at UT Austin, building out the Moonshot project, right? So there were these layers in which things became, it was almost like a phase shift into like a more crystallized, clear level, but it was coming from a combination of looking out and feeling in. And so I have the sense that what may be happening, and I don't want to phrase it as like noosphere or ascension or whatever, but like as we're bathed in information, we're trying to figure out, like, again, I would say, unless you resist it actively, if you are pulled by the feed will pull you into certain thought forms and certain grooves and patterns of thinking that are reinforced, culturally and socially reinforced, to keep people in a certain, under a certain dome, in a certain lane, in a certain archetype. And I feel like that's what's happening. And then because of my lived experience, I could kind of see that because I knew it was coming with ed tech, and I've like stepped back. And then again, I stepped into the alt media, whatever space. And then I realized, oh, okay, that's not it either. That's not what I'm doing. And I step back again, and I keep stepping back. And as I step farther, like I need a communication medium to report back, because if I don't, on the one hand, I feel like I'm doing this selfishly for myself. As I told the Jungian once, I said, I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm leaving clues for my future self that I'll need to know. So maybe this is my thing. Allison, when you're out there the next time, like this is the message to you, to the you of the future. But I do hope that there is something for other people there. So, but how do I keep the red thread of the labyrinth spooling out so that there's actually a way to follow it? And I don't know how that works. So yesterday I uploaded like a 10-minute clip from a longer talk from last year by Neal Stephenson. Neal Stephenson is a really central character in all this. And he, talk about a generalist. He has got lots of books about, he founded the idea of the metaverse. And when we were on our trip, Jason and I were in the van and we were driving to Amache, the Sand Creek Massacre site, okay, out in eastern Colorado, out in the plains. And I said, well, let's listen to the SIGGRAPH, which is the annual conference of digital graphic designers, because Cesium had a 2-day work session there with a lot of the key people who are building out the open metaverse. And the opening speaker was Neal Stephenson. So I'm like, Jason, we should probably listen to this. So we were listening to it. And at one point in the talk, Stephenson describes essentially his launch into the world of emerging technologies. And he had been independently pursuing a way to try to use an automated system to make scans of visual images to look cartoon-like with an automated system. And then this was in, I'm assuming the late 80s. And the computing was very, very basic. And he was trying to do some workarounds. And there was a company whose products he was using. And they said, hey, we're going to this conference. Like, we're looking for exhibitors to show what can be done with our equipment. Could you come and be an exhibitor? And so in 1990, he went to the SIGGRAPH convention in Dallas. And Dallas is really, really central to all of these things. And so you can find on archive.org the SIGGRAPH 1990 Dallas program. And it's like 400 something pages long, including lots of papers, lots of panel presentations, all the committee members. Like, you can see how this thing came about. And so everyone who's like wanting to point at the cabal and the evil guys in the back, I'm like, guys, it's going to be a really weird big net, because most of, and I don't know that it's helpful to throw rocks at these people who may or may not have fully comprehended what was being built. So in it, he talks about that he didn't really get to go to many of the panelists because he had to sit at his table with his display. But in the program, there was a really important presentation about the coming metaverse. Now, this is 1990. Now, in a couple of years later, Neal Stephenson writes Snow Crash and coins the term the metaverse. But they're discussing extended reality. And so there were about 8 people on that panel. And you can go on the channel, just click a couple over and see the Neal Stephenson piece. And I would encourage you to listen. I would encourage you to listen to the whole talk. It's a little boring. Actually, the metaverse stuff does get a little bit boring because it's about tokens and property and art and stuff. But I went through, and the 8 panel members, I put in a comment under each one, their name, and then a brief description of who they were and a link. Because again, I'm kind of offering an open curriculum here, like a free open. If you want to know, it's right there. Like, these are things I think are important. And so one of the people that was on the panel in this 1990 SIGGRAPH on the metaverse was this guy, Warren Robinett. Now, Warren Robinett and Steffer shared an article with me today that was really useful, and I'll pin it under this video. It was from Wired Magazine, and it was reflecting on Warren Robinett's work. And he, in the late 1970s, so I was like in middle school, he developed a console game called Adventure for the Atari system, the Atari 2600 console. And that was in 1979. And so it was the first, I guess the other ones had been text-based games, but this one actually had a joystick, and you could wander around, and the point was to find the chalice, the golden chalice, and along the way you would solve puzzles. So imagine this is the very beginnings, like pixel by pixel, of the immersive gaming space as a problem solution solving space, as a collective intelligence space, as this eusocial hive mind. Now, I don't know that it wasn't a multiplayer game. It was just a single player game. But the very first thing that you could wander around in a virtual world and explore. And it's interesting because evidently Robinett was credited with putting in the first Easter egg in a video game, because Atari they only paid salary to their staff. They didn't give them any copyright or whatever on the designs that they developed. And so Robinett only really got paid like $20,000 that year and the year he developed the game, and he didn't get anything afterwards. But and he was kind of grouchy about it. So at the very end, like if you completed all the quests, you would get to a special room that said created by Warren Robinett. And the story goes that the first person to find this first Easter egg was a 15-year-old from Salt Lake City, Adam Clayton. So you've got Adam, and then you have Clay. So that's an interesting thing. But so this article from Wired, there were a couple of interesting aspects. And for me, the first one that I thought was really important that goes back to this idea of language and how do we communicate this vast scale of information that's out there and make sense of it, right? Because it's almost more than any one brain should have to hold in one place. I mean, and none of us actually can hold it all, but we're all trying to hold more and more and more. And, I feel like I'm kind of hitting a wall of like how much I can hold, and I should probably take a break and just be less in my brain and more in my body for a while. But in it, so it said that Robinett was inspired by a game at Stanford called the Colossal Cave Adventure. Now, the Colossal Cave Adventure was a text-based game, all right? So that's really important because what Robinett did was take a text-based game and turn it into pixels. But he had to be very sparing with the pixels because the computing capacity and memory on this Atari 2600 was really, really limited. And so in a way, it was about graphical interface and file compression, which is what the University of Utah was about, right? Like they were all about digital objects in the internet and file compression. And that's the Adobe part. Like that's the part of the virtual environment that's Adobe's really important about, stripping out all of the stuff that's not necessary and only sticking to the most needed pieces. So the communication interface with the pixels was, I think, in some ways like more interactive with the body and the mind, and more efficient in languaging, like the medium. It wasn't limited by the alphabet, which I know a lot of people have talked about, like the issue of the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis and how language structures your mind. And if you don't have a word for something, it's very hard to articulate it, right? That's why I talk in maps. I'm like, here's a map that like tries to encapsulate all of these ideas that I'm holding all at once. You kind of need to know them all at once. Here's a chunk, right? It's a glyph. These pixels are like that. And so what I realized is that one of the things that's bubbling up, if what's happening, and I'm feeling like it's a collective, it's a globally networked, distributed communication and computing interface, right? That's going to run on Web3, and it's going to run on token exchanges. And there's going to be various kind of game mechanics and things connected to it in terms of like, behavioral psychology and markets and psychoanalysis and all of this, like blending into this space. That the communication in that space is going to have to be more complex than simply what we normally understand today. And you would try to train up the kids, from the littlest, tiniest kids, into this game, into this space of hyper amounts of information, so that they have some sort of new language through which they can communicate their intuitive understandings into the field, like the shared, not the sacred field that's out there, but into an intermediary protocol layer field. Like I feel that that's what's happening. And then the push for younger and younger and younger kids onto these devices, onto the phones, onto these scrying mirrors is about using our behavioral biometrics, using our body language, using our energy fields, possibly using our scent, right? The stigmergy, like these devices are getting, like they're trying to do all the chemosensory and digitize that, the scent, doTERRA is very big on that, and the vibration and the frequency and the voice and the movement, that these things that are collecting all the oscillations, it's about an emergent new language of information that I think is increasingly going to be performance-based, theatrically based, participatory, collective. And it's not going to look like what we understand as a language. And I think that's why the stuff that I'm tiptoeing into around ritual, sacred rituals, ecstatic religion, um, the psychedelics, hallucinant plant medicines, the altered states of consciousness, these group meditations, that this is all trying to get at something that is like synesthetic. And so synesthesia is this idea of blended senses or new sensing mechanisms. And that's something that Steffers has done a lot of looking into, the idea of augmented senses or suppressing our natural senses and inserting new sensing mechanisms, or creating cloud minds that are sensing. Now, again, I see someone saying not necessarily for the better. I'm not co-signing this. At this point, my job, like, I'm wandering out. All right. I'm not here to judge because I don't know. The thing is, at the baseline, I don't know why. The one thing I know is that I don't know. And so that's kind of where I'm holding it at. Like, I'm not approving of it. I'm just looking, because I think if you just look, you can see more than if you look, you stop, you judge. You look, you stop, you judge. You look, and then like a third of your time is spent on the pausing and judging before you pivot back to the thing you were thinking about. And then, so I'm not saying that I agree with these things, but I'm saying I feel like my job is to keep going, right? To talk about this, to talk about, okay, so the thing that is the logical next extension is a new form of communication through languaging that happens in a non-traditional language form that is based off of a glyph or art or performance or ritual or ceremony. And so I think if we hold that, we can look at a lot of things that are happening and bubbling up in the news and in the media and things and go, oh, okay, I can make sense of that. Because what I'm trying to do is, like, I guess, the semiotic stuff. Like, how do we make sense of it? We can judge it later, but first we actually have to make sense of it and then apply the context. Now, I will say, like, part of it is we don't know. And so I would just reference to, like, early on when I was writing about social impact finance, like maybe 2017, I wrote a short piece, and it was featured the Twilight Zone, the classic Twilight Zone episode, To Serve Man. And if you're not familiar with this episode, essentially it's like the aliens come, and it's like the tall giant alien with the tall bald head. And he's like, here's a book. We're here to serve you, And so they whisk off, and this is linguistics, right? This is communication. Like, how are we communicating? So they go off and they try to figure it out. And then the tall giant man is like, selling themselves on the aliens and being there to help humanity and all this stuff. And there's a diligent woman who takes the book, and she's trying to break the code of the language because it's not in English, this book. And so she's looking at it, and then everybody gets won over, and they're going to get on the spaceship. Like, her boyfriend is like going up the steps, and she's running out on the tarmac. She's like, wait, to serve man. It's actually a cookbook. So that's, I think, a cautionary tale is we don't know. Now, it could just as easily be someone shows up and you're convinced they're there to eat you, and they really just wanted to help. Like, so the converse is also possible. It's not always the bad story. So that plus the ender game, like, I just don't know. Like, the thing I'm willing to say is I don't know. I'm looking. We should talk about it. We should be informed. As things are proceeding, we should make sure that people who don't want to do this new thing have a space that they don't have to do it. Like, that our choices aren't impinging on other people's choices, and move forward, right? And so this idea of the synesthesia of complex ideas conveyed in an intuitive way, with maybe the intersection of sensing mechanisms, right? Maybe new sensing mechanisms, but even thinking back. So I do maps because I'm not good at music, and I'm not a good dancer. And I make quilts, but my quilts aren't actually there's an interesting, because I like modern sort of quilting. So I do have aspects of like color theory. I mean, not official color theory, but colors that feel good to me. So that would probably be the closest for me communicating through a quilt. Like, I don't sell my quilts. I give them to people I care about, and I make them for people I care about. And I do still have one that I'm working on, but I keep getting distracted by all this stuff. So there's a communication going on energetically when I make my quilts and I put them together that is not a language. But my quilt is kind of a language, but it's a language of energetic intention. So for me, like, this is why I would like to reach out to people who are in music, who are in the arts fields, who are intuitively thinking about patterns, poetry, literature, song, like these are the spaces that I think we need those kinds of minds to think about a little bit. Because that is the file compression of these deep ways of knowing and sharing that are going to work. Because just me going blah, 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 blah for 6 hours, there's a limited audience for that. There's a limited bandwidth. It's kind of embarrassing that I'm even doing this. I feel like I have to do it because I'll say it long before I can say it shorter. But I think if we're doing this distributed cognition, this shared problem space, there are people with other skill sets and talents that could be doing it with me. So I want to see, like, play around with this idea of synesthesia and communication. And like, if I feel like there is something in a beyond space, I don't know, like I keep kind of joking, it's the interdimensional biofilm. And I'm, in a minute, I'm going to read a little bit from this Children of Time, which is about the bacterial colony, like the slime mold. Maybe there's something that's trying to communicate to us that we, like, in our embodied experience, we don't have the infrastructure to communicate back yet. And so maybe this is a stretch for us to try to figure it out. I don't know what the intentions of that. I don't know if that's a thing. And I don't know if that is a thing, what the intentions of that thing are. But I think it's worth considering, because I think we should, I mentioned today in a comment, like the only thing that we have control over is how we occupy the facts at our disposal, like how we shape them into a story. And so, like I said, I'm currently going to own the story that maybe there is a field of the divine of which we are all sparks and fractals, and maybe the whole point is that we get out and stretch ourselves in experience in really robust ways. And so if everything were always so easy and good, we wouldn't really do a whole lot. And so the ups and downs of life are part of that, communication. And then us communicating it out through art or life or, music or quilts or recipes or whatever are the ways of the divine, God experiencing what it is in this beyond space, in this embodied space. So I guess that's mostly what I'm thinking about, like the intuitive knowing, the complexity of language, synesthesia as part of this language processing. The other thing I will say is I put up some clips yesterday from Michaela Uluru, who is acting on behalf of Ben Goertzel's Singularity Net podcast with John Rogers, the guy who was doing the Mixtable, like Department of Defense entertainment stuff. And they're partnered on this thing called the Le Ciel Foundation, which also Charles Eisenstein is an advisor to that. And they're all about indigenous elders and like primordial ancient wisdom, but they're also totally on board with robot guided meditation and transhumanism. So go figure. And what I'm realizing is I can't remember the company. And so help me. I don't know if anybody's in the chat and you guys know, but a while ago, I remember seeing that there was a guy working on behalf of one of maybe the big pharmaceutical companies in Europe, like either German or Swiss. And what he discovered was that if you took fish eggs and you exposed them to a certain electrical frequency after the fertilized eggs, the resulting fish fry that grew actually reverted back to an older state, like heritage trout or something like that. Like the domesticated farmed version, like would revert to the wild version. And the same with seeds. They did some like vegetable seeds that they exposed it to a certain frequency and then it reverted back to its original state, which was the wild state. And so the other piece of this in terms of the intuitive knowing, and when I see that the Le Ciel people are interested in primordial indigenous knowing, but also the robot guided meditation, right? They're totally on board for all the emerging tech, is that if there's an intuitive knowing that comes from the divine that's outside this material reality, that we get these epiphanies coming through, once we get an idea of something and it comes into our consciousness, it's structured by our consciousness, right? So think about how our consciousness has been structured by all kinds of technologies. I mean, society civilization is a technology. Your family is a technology. Books are technologies. TV shows are technologies. And then now we've got the feed as a technology. And so our minds from being our littlest baby selves are like being shaped. So an idea bubbles up and then it kind of gets into your consciousness and then like it has to like fit into this existing architecture. So there may be aspects of it that didn't fit, but it's made to fit into your conception of the world. And that's part of the challenge with like my family is they couldn't, like my husband, he's like, I can't keep up. Like I just can't keep up. So like, and he says, you've changed. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of have changed. I mean, I feel like I'm more me. I mean, I'm still totally me, the core part of me that is me, but I keep evolving. Right. And so like my mind, I think, is shifting, and other people maybe have a choice that they just like to be comfortable in one particular kind of mind and they just kind of stay there. Like no shade. I still do love my husband, but his mind he's very comfortable just staying right where he is. And mine is like, moving around. And so it is what it is. But if you imagine this whole primordial wisdom thing, like imagine they could try to use these lucid dreaming EEG devices or frequency to mesmerize us with these AI coaches back into a state that is more primordial, right? There's this other woman, Dana Clissanans, who's all about rewilding your mind, right? I think they want the system wants an undomesticated version, but then if it can access the undomesticated inner knowing, it has to have a way to expand that beyond the individual into the collective, I guess. Like if you have the inner knowing, but it's just you, it's not useful to the system, right? And so there's something about the wild version of going. So the other thing that I wanted to say before like doing the little read aloud is if you put on this lens, and I'm not saying I know that this is definitely the thing. Like I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there's stuff that I've seen that doesn't make sense under the stories that I'm given. So I'm just going to keep looking till I find a story that seems to have a more unifying trajectory, right? And so far, this actually helps me understand things a lot. So why ed tech? Why give ed tech to 3-year-olds? Oh, because you want their inner knowing, right? It's monitoring. Why are we doing telemedicine? Why are we doing remote monitoring of women of the global south? Why do we want them to put like remote monitoring radiation devices on their pregnant stomachs? Why do we want to monitor fetuses all the time? Oh, well, maybe it's because unborn babies, have a consciousness that is both of the world in the mother and of the divine while they're in utero. That would make sense why you would want to slap these monitoring devices on women, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense. They want to know what those babies are dreaming. They're in the dream time. I mean, just think about it. Like they're in the dream time. Those babies are in the dream time. And so you would set this thing up with conditional cash transfers. So why is it that like we all tested that stuff on poor women in the Yucatan, right? And people who were in remote areas with very rich, diverse ecosystems? Because probably the energetics of indigenous primordial ways of knowing in man embedded in the environment are highly sophisticated technology. And they want a tool to get in there, but then they need a language, right? Because a traditional language that's coming out of your mouth isn't going to do it. So I'm just kind of just putting these things out there because I think they're important concepts. And, and it's interesting. So I will just say, and again, this is like no shade at all, but this is just part of my life story. And I'm sharing it because I think it's useful. We all have our own life story. So my husband's family, I never really got a chance to meet any of them because they all died before we met in college. But my husband's grandfather, who died before he was born, was he went to Colgate University, like in the 19 teens. which was, it wasn't the elitist school, but it was like in this group of schools. He was recruited to be in the ambulance corps in World War I, and that's what they did. The ambulance corps recruited these elite people, like people from Tony schools, and put them together. And then in the ambulance corps, there was a lot of X-ray stuff with Marie Curie, and so I think those people got irradiated. He died young of a heart thing, supposedly, but I don't know. It was the 50s, and his name was Maxwell Irwin McDowell. You can look him up. He was a prominent tax attorney for Standard Oil, and he did a lot with the IRS. And that's a game. So Maxwell was a super clever guy. He was an artist. He was very good, very clever with words. I have his diaries and things. He was a very, very bright man. And so that was Maxwell, and Maxwell was very good at that game. That was a game. He had two sons, Jim and John. So Jim was my husband's father, and he was very academic. He was very studious, and this is my understanding. They grew up in Scarsdale, New York, and he was in the military in the 1950s in Germany. He loved that, and then he came back and he got a PhD at Johns Hopkins. So, we know kind of the backstory of Johns Hopkins, right? And this is at the time where all the applied physics lab stuff would have been going on. Now, he was under contract and he translated Nazi war documents, which is a certain language, right? So he was the Weimar Republic was his expertise, and he later became a professor at Wake Forest. And he sang. He was very into Gilbert and Sullivan opera. So they were both musical, Jim and John. But Jim was very traditional, and traditional pathway, Johns Hopkins, translation, language. That's a certain pathway. His brother John ended up being the black sheep of the family, didn't fit in at all, and he became an avant-garde composer in the Village in the 60s. And he was part of something called the Judson Street Project. And his papers are actually in the Library of Congress. And he was this avant-garde composer. And the Judson Street Project, they also worked with dance. And the dance was very unusual, based in, it was conceptual. And a lot of it was based in the body as mechanical, as sinew and bone and normal everyday life, and sort of jarring juxtapositions. But to me, it goes along with the idea of dance as a language. They were communicating something very complex in these dance compositions. And so I think about just my own lived, not direct lived experience, because I married into this family that I never knew only through their papers, which is, again, another communication device. I only know them through photos or letters or online information, from their papers, finding aids and different things. But there's this communication across time, and the communication involves, there's a language one and there's a body one. And so I think we're moving more into the body, and that Web3, these gaming environments that will be puzzle solving and problem solving, will be about embodied intelligence, but weirdly inverted, the body as recreated as an armature and re-rendered in a space that doesn't have normal physics, and that is more run by magicians, kind of. And that's exactly in the Stevenson book, in A Diamond Age. There's a whole scene where the guy, the bespoke engineer who creates the primer, ends up on this boat, it's on a boat because that's consciousness, participating in a dramatic action that he thinks he's in the audience, only he's actually an actor. And so I think that's where we're going, is that the new adventure that we're on is an adventure of consciousness and emotion embodied in a body that's reflecting into a spatial reality that, who knows, to serve man. What does that mean exactly? So anyway, those are the things that I wanted to say. Just, again, keeping in mind synesthesia, language, performance, body movement, and the holding out that we don't really know what it is, and that maybe the social computing is part of a communication system. So I'm going to read, I got paper copies of this. And this is, I'm just going to read about 6 pages, but there's 2 characters that are touched on. This first chapter 5 is only 2 pages long, and this is the biofilm. Now, I was like most of the way through the book before I realized it was a bacterial colony. And then the second chapter, chapter 6, is the octopus. And so I've talked a lot about the octopus in the past, but the octopus, it is, I don't know that it's in actually this particular chapter, but what stays with me is this idea of, again, distributed cognition. And so, there's a goal setting behavior at the top, and then the arms sort of explore local conditions and report back. And then there's a collective communication. But the octopi, and I think again, they're very popular. I mean, there's a lot of books about octopi and TV shows about octopi and whatever, that the octopi communicate through dance, pretty much. It's motion, and the motion is also photonic because they can change their skin. And that's nano, really, like that's natural nanotechnology, is this ability to communicate. And there's a whole section where the octopus is trying to communicate with the human and feeling really sad for the human that they don't have much nuance in what they can say or how they can think. And that the octopus has a different sort of wisdom because of its biology, which I think is really interesting. That's the thing about Tchaikovsky that I think is really fascinating about these books, is what he talks about is Umwelt, which again, the sensory, which, Steffers really brought to my attention. We're sort of, again, hammering home the idea of sensing and sense making. How do you sense things? How do you make sense of them? What story do you tell from them? So, and that's kind of, it's funny because I did that last talk about like suitcases full of rocks. And I really don't mean that the people who have the suitcases of rocks are bad people. Like, it's just a different way of being, because I definitely carried around my suitcase of rocks for quite a number of years. And that's not to say I might not go back and pick myself up some rocks when I feel like I need them. But for now, when I set the rocks down, like many more of these things are crystallizing in my mind about how this actually is. And so I think it's, I just want to share that because it's something worth considering if you feel like you're sort of hitting walls or things, that there's other options. Okay, so this is from Children of Ruin by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I'm going to read chapter 5 and 6. And he's also got a bunch of books. This is from 2019, so this is fairly recent. Okay, chapter 5. We listen. Information on either side of us. The crackling discharge of meaning for generations. Now, for me, the thing that jumps out, again, information. There's something listening, and it's across generations, so it's the time scale. And so that's increasingly what I believe, is that what's unfolding may be outside of the time scale of the reality that we currently understand. We listen, dying and renewing and feeding, careful not to upset the balance. These of we have achieved. The world around us is quiescent now. We have made our peace with it. And what have we found? We cannot know, but we store and process, construct our theories and our models within the labyrinthine structures of our libraries. Each pattern of information that comes to us is examined and passed on one side to the other and back. Now, I will say in this book, like, I came to have empathy for the bacterial colony biofilm. Because ultimately, and the third book that he has is about corvids and this idea of novelty, because I definitely chase novelty. Like, that's me. And again, I don't know to what end. This idea of storing, processing, that's the novelty. And in this, ultimately, the biofilm is looking for a perch for a new adventure, like this adventure thing that Warren Robinette was working on. It was always looking for a new adventure. Didn't actually mean to hurt the thing that it jumped into. It just wanted the new view. And so I have like empathy for that, because I could imagine if I were a biofilm, that's how I would feel. Like there's a interspecies bridge, I guess, between us. And so when I look at things like the World Institute that Julia Stolman was talking about, or Eugene Garfield and his World Brain, or the Project Xanadu, or these other things. Like, I can see the purpose of interconnected information. I guess what I'm trying to do and how I hope what I'm doing is different is that I'm exploring, and I'm hopefully not imposing any of this on anybody else. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to be here. And I'm not trying to change the world and make it so that you have to think about things the way I think about them. And I really want us to all talk about them together. And I think a lot of the people who are developing these larger systems, they're telling one story about what they're doing, but there's a deeper story to it that doesn't surface. And I think it's really, that's a problem because we're not making full informed consent. Okay, so back to the reading. We are constructing a picture of the complexities of this new land. These of we are beginning to understand the existence of an identity. These patterns tell us stories of greater spaces and arrangements of structures beyond. We listen and we learn that this great world we have found is small, that it orbits amongst others, that this assembly of electricity is its own library of concepts utterly alien to us. But we are intrepid and we are inquisitive and we can adapt. We are listening. We are learning about all the places outside this, our new vessel. And so really what this is like, it's jumped into somebody's body. This alien biofilm has jumped into somebody's body. And again, I had made the acquaintance of someone who was looking into parasitic consciousness. But it wasn't jumping in because it wanted to be mean. It was jumping in because it was looking for the next thing. And that's what it was built to do. And so for me, part of this idea of greater spaces and nested things within things, when I was when Jason and I went out after the Mormon Transhumanist Conference, we went out to Arches National Park. And part of that landscape, which is very much mineral consciousness, stone, some plants, but mostly rock consciousness. But there were this amazing, lichen, but not just the cyanobacteria, which is green, which essentially, I think it was the cyanobacteria that created oxygen in the atmosphere. And these things are connected to be like soil crust. And I guess maybe I'd heard of soil crust, but it didn't really strike me in. And they're like, you need to be careful where you walk because the soil crust is this biogeochemistry. And it's very, very fragile, right? It takes hundreds of years to build like a little bit of soil crust. And I'm looking at the soil crust and thinking, wow, like we're to the soil crust. Like, are we the soil crust to something else? Like if we're looking down at the soil crust, we're like, that's amazing. Like, look at this constellation of life in this like little thing. Are we that to something much greater? I don't know. And this passage about the biofilm, that's what strikes me, is that they're exploring. They've jumped into this new world that's a whole new constellation that they're figuring out the patterns. We are growing. The information feeds us. Processing this new data is turning us into something more than we were because we must stretch to accept such new ideas. We model the sensory inputs of our vessel, the motor outputs, most of all, the busy transition of information. Such life, such wonder as our vessel talks to itself through us. And so, again, there's something about this thing. It doesn't look down on the body. It's like its own God or its own opportunity, like in there. It has wonder over it. So like this traditional idea of what's like the predator, like later on, it becomes rather like the cascade becomes more violent. But initially, it's simply like exploring, and it's the body as vantage point. One generation understands enough. One generation has modeled enough. We know the vessel and the spaces and other complexities that it talks to itself about. One generation begins to change the information as it passes through us. inserting our own data, modifying its parameters, speaking to it in its own voice. So then that is the change that happens. So then it's taking over the operating system. It goes from being, its own self to integrating and then overtaking, which, I think we would not want. But it doesn't see it as a problem. And so this speaks to one of the other clips I included was with John Rogers presenting at this keynote 75 at Bretton Woods 75 keynote. And he's talking about the movie Lucy, which is Scarlett Johansson is, I guess, ends up being put in a position of being a drug mule by her boyfriend, and it's inserted into her body, but it's a psychedelic that ultimately puts her across space and time. And at the climax of the movie, she's injects all the rest of the drugs into her system and becomes like a crazy carbon nano supercomputer, right? And then spits out a hard drive and then dissolves in a poof on the floor. And that's John Rogers, the DoD Hollywood guy, who would have been in on the National Nanotechnology Initiative from the ground floor, is this is his favorite movie. So I do feel like there is something coming in this communication that we should be mindful of. But it's as we're being mindful, I think we have to just manage our reaction to it in such a way that if we throw up the panic thing immediately, we're going to end up getting stopped and stalled out in actually the knowing of it. And, I'm not judging. I'm not saying oh, we're better people if we can manage our emotion and know it better. It's just, I think some of us are supposed to know it better. So that's just these 2 pages about the biofilm, these of we. So then this is the chapter. This is a chapter about the octopus. And it's interesting because the guy who raises these octopi that have been sort of terraformed, he too is on the spectrum. So he's a brilliant engineer, but he has this spectrum attitude. Paul 97, that's an octopus, lives in a colony with 139 other octopi. In the wild, back on Earth, his species is one of the more social of his kind. And this means little more than good living space is limited and they tolerate each other's presence, with plenty of fighting and evictions in the dominance displays. Some might say that human societies often reach the same level, but in truth, the octopi on Earth have no familial contacts and their offspring drift away on the tide. The inhabitants of any given octopus city are in constant turnover. And yet amongst such solitary creatures, it's a start. If you hate your neighbors, then you need a brain that can know just which ones you hate the most, which are stronger and which are weaker. Paul's species has lived with the concepts of individuals and boundaries and even a kind of diplomacy for a long time. They just haven't enjoyed it much. The Rus Khalifi nanovirus, applied with discerningly light hand by Disra Senkevi, has been working chiefly with these parts of the brain. Paul has no offspring yet, but others of his colony have, and the juveniles hang close, where before they would ride off on the currents to some other place or be devoured by their parents' generation. They lived longer too, and at the moment an individual might manage half a century, though few do. The most prominent cause of death so far is curiosity. There are areas of the sea still not properly oxygenated, areas that are toxic for other reasons, and sometimes the machinery they interact with is the culprit. However, multiple generations live in each colony grudgingly, tolerating each other's presence. Where before they might dwell in rock piles or great sloughs of mussel shells, their appetite inadvertently leading to their architecture, now they live in crates and pipes and outlets around the terraforming machines where they can communicate with Senkevi and the Aegean. Paul 97's understanding of the world is ephemeral, inhuman. He hangs in the water column between the angel and the ammonite. His crown is a whirl of instinct and emotion that nonetheless encompasses the complex social arrangements he must make daily to accommodate the other inhabitants of the colony. He has concepts for the wider world, for the Aegean, the tanks of which he dimly remembers, for certain prominent citizens of his metropolis, and equally for certain subsystems of the terraforming machinery. His world is not rigidly quantified. He does not measure nor calculate it, but simply knows and feels in response to that knowledge. And that's the inner knowing that I'm talking about. His guise, that shifting tapestry of skin and shape, resonates to those feelings to a far more exacting extent than those of his ancestors. Or else he takes a more direct hand in it, so that if the mood takes him, he might drift over to the colony and dance out his frustrations or his wonderment for the others. To be open to his emotions is to communicate them to his peers and impinge upon their own crowns with his thoughts. And that's what I mean about the dance performance. It is a language of grand gestures and infinitely exacting emotional scales. He is an artist. They all are. Their conscious mode of interaction conveys far more subtext and abstract expression than it ever does hard information. Beneath this conscious whirl lies the subminds of his arms that dispose of what he proposes. The separation of will from machinery that puts that will into motion has grown as the nanovirus leached into the species' wider nervous systems. Paul solves problems like a wizard, a thought, a desire, and his reach extends to fulfill it. Sometimes this means a fight where intimate contact between his arms and another's imposes dominance and simultaneously passes information from reach to reach, a whole black market of calculating power that Paul and his peers don't even know they have. In this partnership, each entity, a committee, they get things done. Senkevi has given them the tools and the perspective. Although they never quite see the big picture in a very real sense, they grasp it. Senkevi has not noticed, for example, that the geothermal vents are becoming misaligned and inefficient, and the parts of the seafloor are becoming uncomfortably cool. For him, up on the Aegean, it is all within tolerance. The problem would not be flagged up by his system for years. For Paul and his kin, it is uncomfortable, and they have wrestled and fought and performed complex poems of dance and color for each other until an unacknowledged consensus was reached. Then they went and adjusted the machinery or instructed other machines to fix those machines, following the great plan Senkevi gave them of how one thing becomes another and how it all adds up to become home. So I hope you guys are following me. Like, if I could talk in maps, I might want to also talk in excerpts, because this is it. I think like this encapsulates a huge whole chunk of one of my maps, is this part. I'm just going to read it again. Now, and think about this as social computation and intuition and language and energetics. Is this what's going on? And if so, to what end? I mean, to me, the jumping to what end and presuming and then acting or reacting in an emotional way, like for me now, it seems like it does not serve us well. But in the understanding of it, in the intuitive understanding, and to me, like, think about this as remote viewing, precognition, the consensus, that's the tokens, right? That's the futarchy, that's the liquid democracy. But it's not happening through an AI on a leaderboard, it's happening through a dance. And so that's, it's weird. I'm not weird. I'm just, like, I think you're here because I'm an authentic person, right? Like, I mean, I'm trying to be authentic and I'm not trying to mislead. I'm just trying to like walk my walk. And so I was good in school. Like, I did all the things. I wasn't a rebel in school. I wasn't a rebel till very late in my life. But it can happen when you start to see the pattern. And so I got a partial scholarship to college. I went to Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And like, as part of that, they like to reach out to alumni or whatever and say, like, what are you up to? Like, so like hoping that, the people they've invested in their scholarship dollars have done some amazing thing. Right? And I remember at the time when I got this, inquiry, I was in the middle of doing my school research. And, on paper, according to standard measures, I wasn't particularly successful. I wasn't making a lot of money. At the time, I still had a happy family, and I felt very productive in doing this activist work around schools. And I said that. And so I think that But my background was in art history and then ultimately historic preservation. That's not a marketable skill in the grand scheme of things. In the world the way it is, it's not actually something that's sought after, this generalist. But this is what the John Rogers of the world want at their mixed tables, only they would like for them to be participants in. I don't know if they want people to be speaking back to the system, which is what I would tend to do. But it is the seeing the pattern in the picture. And then the question is how to dance it, how to encapsulate it within poetry or music. That is my weak point, because I don't have that. I know that music is important. That's not how my brain works. I know dance is important. I'm certainly no dancer. I'm just a stocky peasant gardener. Like, it is like the work through Eve zines or through banjo glasses, glass art with the dandelion, is through these other measures that we're going to be able to communicate this. So that's sort of what I'm putting out to people. But let me just read this again about the octopi, because I think the psychodrama, collective performance, collective languaging towards problem solving is the thing that we are being wrapped into in Web3. To what end, I don't know. Although they never quite see the big picture, in a very real sense, they grasp it. Senkevi has not noticed, for example, that the geothermal vents are becoming misaligned and inefficient, and that parts of the seafloor are becoming uncomfortably cool. So that is the sensing. That is, won't you be my sensor, right? And ultimately, I think they want a mind that can be attuned to that. And I think that the wave of people who both, I think the autism spectrum disorder and the dementia are part of creating those minds that are suited and attuned to very specific pattern recognition. For him, up on the Aegean and with intolerance, the problem would not get flagged by his systems for years. For Paul and his kin, it is uncomfortable. So they sense it. There's something in the solution that is an inner sensing that is beyond simply the leaderboard. And that is what the octopi have an intuition about. And I believe that this guided evolution is guiding humans into a eusocial behavior that is suited to that computation. But I think it's suited in that we have a spark of the divine in us. We're not simply mechanical things. We're not machines. That this intuitive aspect of being connected into the fabric of the cosmic divine is not something that a machine would have. And so that's why you want a living sensing mechanism that's not simply just a silicon wafer. They have wrestled and fought and performed complex poems of dance and color for each other until an unacknowledged consensus was reached. And so, like, imagine that in the world of influencer culture, of geopolitics. Like, imagine what this all is that we're in. Like, what are we in? Like, is it some grasping, grabbing, complex consensus-making exercise? What does it look like? What does that look like when it's not octopi and it's people, when it's in people, embodied people and virtual people in a feed stream? Like, what does that look like? Because that's what it feels like where it's going. Then once they had the consensus, and that's the sociocracy, they adjusted the machinery or instructed the other machines to fix those machines following the great plan Senkevi gave them. And so again, that's machines fixing the machines. That's this nested layers of information, which is, I think, what, Michael Levin speaks to, is these levels of knowing. And sometimes they're nested, and sometimes you don't actually grasp the bigger picture, but you're intuiting it within the social context that you occupy. Senkevi will come across their tampering later and scratch his head to work out what they were trying to achieve. The experiment is long out of his control, but though Paul 97 and the other individual octopi might seem petty, self-interested, and antisocial, they have the wisdom of multitudes. And that is what this is after. The wisdom of the crowd is what they're after. That is what Jeffrey Yass and Susquehanna International Group and the effective altruism and the ChatGPT I'm firmly convinced that the narratives around all of that are around materialism and that are around that on purpose, because what is actually the most important is the ephemeral and the energetic. And that is what they're trying to interface with and language and capture. And not necessarily capture to kill or to stop, but to use it in the distributed cognition sense. That there is an intuitive computing interface that is so highly efficient, that it has a precognition, that it can fix all of the problems before anything even arises. And, and I think the goal is to use children for that purpose. And, we're back to, I was, reminded of that. I was talking with Lynn Davenport, because I have a whole huge thing I want to talk about Dallas and myths and all of these things. But in that movie Snowpiercer, at the end, they make it to the front of the train, right, through all the caste systems. And ultimately, what was running the train was a small child in the engine. And so I think that this interface system will run on child consciousness and imagination. And I'm not at all comfortable with that. And at that point, like, for me saying I'm not weighing in on good, bad, children can't consent to any of this. And I feel like as adults, like, we have to draw the line in terms of the other beings and the children, that isn't, like, they cannot give informed consent. And that is what's so problematic about the blurring around child labor in the digital space. That if the future of work is crypto play to earn psychodrama, that's a problem, right? And I don't even know how to talk to people about the idea that this seems to be what is coming out. All of these stories on the surface, it's not to say that those are outright lies, but they're woefully incomplete stories of what's been happening since Warren Robinett and the console adventure game of 1979. Right? There's been a lot that's been unfolding since I was in middle school, and not just with the video game interfaces, but with the Internet of Bio-Nano things. I just came across a 400-page book from the National Nanotechnology Initiative in 2002. We don't know enough to give consent to this. We simply don't. And then how do we talk about it in a way that isn't panicked alarmism, but is rational enough that we can get people to start to interface? What is the language? How do we language this to people? That's the challenge. And it feels to me like somehow it's glyphs, or, do we talk in TV shows and book clips and maps, and like, how is this interactive? Maybe do we create, and then again, we're looking at what's his name, Ascot or whatever, and this idea of virtual art being entangling us with our biophotons. Like, are we all entangled in the biophotons because I'm sitting here talking about this right now? Like, I don't know. There's a lot of things I don't know, but I think there's a whole lot to this puzzle that is worth talking about. Okay, the wisdom of multitudes. Other colonies communicate with them, one facility to the next. Some individuals travel seeking less abrasive neighbors, avoiding genetic stagnation. Others insert dummy orders of crates and piping into the Aegean's task queue and create instant new towns awaiting inhabitants. As before, they are prying into every connected space they can access, physical and virtual. Unlike the catastrophe that shut down the Aegean and saved it, they understand enough not to break anything too essential. Paul 97 and some of the others have a concept that it is Senkevy. It is a complicated thing, but despite his own thoughts on the matter, it does not approach traditional divinity. Human concepts of God are familial, after all, too often paternal, and Paul does not understand the concept of family much, nor would he have affection for it if he did. But they like Senkevy as they conceive of him. He represents benevolence and home and knowledge in a way that does not compete with them, as they all compete with each other. And some few of them wonder if he is an individual like them. But the idea of another individual does not constantly getting on their nerves and into their space is more alien to them even than the human cognition of Disra Senkevy. So I guess that's it for the afternoon, right? Disra Senkevy is their god in the background, creating the space. And again, are the octopi happy? Are they unhappy? Do they know where they are? Are they fulfilling their destiny? Like, so many questions. So anyway, thanks for wandering. Just to recap concepts: Umwelt, synesthesia, participatory communication, collective communication dancing, to serve man. What is this adventure game that we're in? That's the thing. The biofilm's always saying, we're going on an adventure. We're going on an adventure. And I think this is an adventure, I think this is quite an adventure. So we'll see, guys. Thanks for hanging out. I'll have more to come. I am going to sit down and work on the maps next. I just didn't have it in me. I wanted to kind of lay some of this out first. All right. And again, thanks to Sean and thanks to Steffers, particularly and there's another friend in Virginia, in Virginia, that been bouncing these ideas around on. And thanks to Jason for providing structure for the conversations that we're going to have later. It's good.